evening, everybody, and welcome to our live discussion exploring different perspectives on Canadian history. Canada, the Story of Us has sparked a lot of debate and conversation. And really, it's not surprising. History tends to do that. In a country that embraces its diversity, there are going to be a wide array of opinions, and some of them might clash. One TV show can only do so much. So tonight, we expand the conversation to include more voices and perspectives. And we want to hear from you. Leave comments and ask questions. We have a team of producers monitoring Facebook and YouTube so we can get your voice onto the panel as well. This week, we're discussing different perspectives on Canadian history. Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs, et bienvenue à cette
Good evening,
émission
ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this live transmission of CBC on YouTube. We would like to invite you to participate, to take part in this exploration in French, if you like, on various perspectives of Canadian history. I'm Mike Finnerty.
I'm Mike Finnerty. I'm the host of Daybreak, the CBC Radio 1 morning show in Montreal. Joining us in Fredericton, Sasha Mullally, Canada National History Society board member and editor of Acadiensis. She's also Associate Professor of History at the University of New Brunswick. In Montreal, Jacques Jedwab, President of the Association of Canadian Studies and the Canadian Institution for Identities and Migration. And here in the studio, Brenda Westasakut of the University of Toronto's Centre of Indigenous Studies, Lise-Marie Baudry, who's Director of Le Centre Francophone de Toronto, and Marcel Martel, who is Professor of History at York University and holder of the A.V. Bennett Historica Chair in Canadian History. So the program, Canada, the Story of Us, has sparked a number of different reactions. A debate over who can lay claim to the first European settlement, over the portrayal of Samuel de Champlain, concerns that key stories like the Acadians have been left out. These are things that people believe are crucial to the understanding of today's Canada. And I want to start panel by asking you all, were you surprised by the type of response that we saw from the audience? And Sasha in New Brunswick, I'll start with you.
Actually, no, I wasn't surprised at all. I could tell from the first few moments of the first episode of Canada, the Story of Us, that there was going to be a robust response from the Atlantic region.
Why from the first few moments?
Well, it's the starting point for the series that I knew would cause a bit of a stir on this end of Canada. The absence of any kind of reference to the cod fishery or the centuries of prosecution of any kind of fishery from the shores of Atlantic Canada was certainly going to get the attention of scholars and public history academics. On this side of Canada, it's the story of a phenomenally valuable resource that explains why Europeans become interested in what we come to know as North America. And so leaving that out of the narrative, I knew was going to elicit a response.
Jack Jedwab, were you surprised by the audience response?
Yeah, I guess I was somewhat surprised by the audience response. I mean, I think it's fully to be expected that people across the country who want to see their particular part of the narrative be properly reflected are going to react. But I guess the part that surprised me was the reaction of my government here in Quebec at the National Assembly with the political parties getting so involved in the particular issue.
The government getting involved.
I could see the various academics, researchers, the broad public engaging in a discussion about this and reacting with some concerns and about, as I said, things not reflected. But to see the government get so involved surprised me a bit.
Brenda, what about you? When you saw the program, were you surprised to see that there was a level of response there was from the audience? Controversy?
I just only learned about it recently.
Did it feel controversial to you?
Not really. I haven't really heard too much about it here in Toronto.
It's not something people are grabbing you on the street to talk
No.
about. Marcel Martel, what about you? The audience response, what did you make of it?
Well, I wasn't surprised, and not that I'm not trying to be original, but I concur with what I have heard, so far. The reason I say I was not surprised, it's because of some of the choices that have been made. Well, those choices were controversial.
And to add to this, when almost 15 years ago, there was a different series called Canada People's History, there was also a strong reaction, not from politicians, but mostly from scholars. And since we were reminded that the National Assembly in Quebec, there was a motion, acknowledging the fact that there were some holes in the story. Well, the Premier of Nova Scotia was the first one, to go and ask for an apology or an acknowledgement of the fact that if we want to tell the story of us, well, we have to start with the Atlantic provinces.
Lise Marie?
No, I'm not surprised because people are very attached to their own version of history. And we are, from coast to coast to coast, we are being taught different versions of that same or supposedly same history. So yes, definitely, it's a difficult thing to tell and to ensure that it encompasses everything.
Are discussions of history usually this contentious?
Yes, they are. Yeah. And I can tell you as well, because I work with newcomers to Canada, and what they come with and what they learn here about our history is very different from what we grew up being taught about history. So it's a constant, for me, it's a constant a reminder that history is something that is constantly evolving as you learn more about it, as you discover more.
CBC's Neil MacDonald wrote on the subject of the story of us on our website, and I'm going to pull one of his quotes. He said, "Because all history is political, it's always told by the winners, it is necessarily infused with bias, and once a generally accepted version of events is settled upon, revisionist evidence is unwelcome in the extreme." Marcel, I know you're not a historian proprement dit, but you've grown up in this country, as we all have. To what extent is there a generally accepted version of history in Canada?
Well, I want to reassure everybody, I am an historian. I teach, history. Then in terms of credential, I am an historian. Once I've said that, of course, we have spent, the last 200 or 300 years, writing our history. And the reason it's so political, it's when you decide, to propose a narrative. Well, if the narrative is not inclusive and the narrative leaves several groups out, well, we should expect reactions, strong reactions from those groups. And often we say, well, we should expect better. We should expect better in terms of making sure that groups that should be included should be there. Well, when those groups are not there, we should not be surprised that those groups will react, so strongly. And just to illustrate my point, 15 or 20 years ago, suppose there would have been something similar to what Canadians are asked to watch. The series would have started with, the discovery. Well, the word discovery, this is a word that, is now banned because nobody discovered. Aboriginals were already here. And what we have to do now is to make sure that Indigenous voices not only are there, but we should spend an entire episode just on, those societies before the arrival of, non-Aboriginals.
We have a comment from one of the people listening on Facebook Live and YouTube, watching, I should say. Do you think, this is from Angela Mashford Pringle, and she asks, do you think that this year's 150th celebration of Canada's Confederation, that we should revise Canada's history to ensure that minority and oppressed voices are heard? Brenda.
Yes, for sure. Our story has been excluded or hidden, and so we do need to hear that story or that version of our history, and definitely starting in elementary schools. A lot of children are growing up in Canada not knowing what happened to First Nations people here.
How do we tend to do with Indigenous history in Canada?
Well, we tend to be invisible. Indigenous peoples are not represented a lot of the time in our history. as contributors, you know, to making this great country so great. You know, we're not recognized that much in education, especially.
In the program, Canada, the Story of Us, did it feel like you're us too?
No, I was wondering, who is us? Wait a minute, you know, what about us, Indigenous peoples?
How do you think that the programmers did with the representation of Indigenous stories and history on the show?
You mean in the show?
Yeah.
I guess they're trying to include it. It's the beginning, I guess.
Okay. The comment from Neil where he argued that revisionist evidence is unwelcome. In other words, people tend to have a version of the past and think, maybe don't mess with my history. Marcel Martel, would you agree that's true, that people come to history and don't like people messing around with their version that they've learned?
Well, this happens, you know, all the time. You know, for instance, if we were in a museum, if you decide to put together, you know, a new museum exhibit, don't be surprised if some people, you know, claim that they have a voice. But again, what has happened, you know, so far, it's not that people say don't mess with my history. What people expect is if they watch, you know, the story of us, they expect, you know, to be able to identify, you know, themselves. And when they reach a conclusion that not only they have been ignored, but the way they have been, you know, portrayed, well, they cannot recognize, well, we shouldn't be surprised that they are upset, you know, for instance, Acadians. Earlier, you know, we were reminded that, well, the Maritimes are, you know, almost, you know, not mentioned. Well, you have Acadians, and since, you know, the story of us is supposed to be a story on, you know, dark pages or dark moments in our history, well, you have something that was quite terrible, deportation, that, you know, Acadians, you know, had to deal with in 1755, and not a single, you know, mention. Then again, it's not that people say to us, don't mess us with my history. What people remind us, it's, well, if you're trying to do something about my history, make sure that my voice is there. And we mentioned, you know, earlier about, you know, Indigenous people. It's true that in every episode, there has been, you know, a segment. We saw it with the War of 1812, where, you know, there is the story of Tecumseh. Before that, the first episode, the first, you know, 5 minutes, it's about, you know, Indigenous, you know, people in general. However, you know, they disappear. And what we expect, it's not only they will be there, you know, throughout the story, but they would also, for instance, you know, last week, well, 2 days ago, the episode about, you know, economic development, where the focus was, you know, on Southern Ontario, you know, Southern Quebec. But what about all the Indigenous people living, you know, West? They did not disappear. They were there. They, you know, they traded with others, and they were not part of the story. Again, to go back to the question, it's not people are telling us, do not mess up with my story. They tell us, if you plan to write something about us as a group, make sure that we are included, you know, from the beginning, and not just, you know, some segments here and there.
Is there such a thing, though, Lise Marie, as a consensus on what is Canadian history?
I wish
what
there
the
was.
important things are, what the things that must not be left out.
I think that's something that we still have to work on. That there would be a basic understanding of the facts, and we keep discovering new facts. I'm not expecting one version of history that is good for the rest of time. I don't think that's possible, and I don't think we should wish for that, because our understanding of history evolves all the time, and it should evolve, and it should be fed by new perspectives all the time. But yes, we could do a better job of getting to a consensus about the basic facts. I think so.
Je vais vous donner un exemple parce que
I'm going to give you an example because we Anglophones in Quebec, we are not too comfortable with our place in the history which is being taught at home. How is it for Francophones in the other parts of Canada? I'm going to start by telling you that I grew up in Montreal, and the history I was being taught when I was young was really extremely biased. I didn't know that. I found out later when I started working across Canada. But as I grew up, the version of history did not speak to me about Francophones in other provinces, except the episode of the Acadian deportation, and then Louis Riel, and the only mention of the First Nations that I can remember was the martyrdom of Father Brébeuf and Joseph Lallemand, and a little bit about the Riel episode, and that was the only reference. Then later on, as I traveled across Canada, that I heard about other parts of Canada's history, and by personal curiosity, I started reading and understanding other parts of the history, especially about the contribution of the First Nations, and also about the contribution of all the others, Francophones, Allophones, who built Canada.
Well, I think on that point, in terms of the teaching of Quebec history, currently, there's very little, if anything, accorded to Anglophones as part of our history, and that's true for minorities in Quebec that are ethnic minorities as well. So when I grew up, basically in the history I consumed, we did learn about the British and the British conquest, and what you see today, by and large, in Quebec, in terms of teaching of history, is almost a subtle association of the Anglophone reality, which doesn't get represented outside of the British early presence in the history that's offered in the high school right now. So again, without digressing, I found it somewhat paradoxical that the government of Quebec made such a big issue out of the inclusion of Francophones and others in the story of us, when in Quebec we're also not seeing much in the story of us as it's told about Quebec as regards its minorities. I'm not suggesting that some of the points that weren't raised by some people in the government were illegitimate, but it is paradoxical, ironic, if you like, that we're seeing the same phenomenon the other way in our high schools in Quebec.
A comment that Deborah left on our Facebook page. Someone forgot about Port Royal and the very first French settlement in Canada. Honestly, my blood is beginning to boil as I think of this. European settlement started in the Atlantic provinces. Sasha, can we look at the debate over Port Royal and whether it was the first European settlement in Canada?
Well, there's certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that it is. Just a few years before Quebec City was founded in 1608. It's a very important sort of moment in Canadian history for a number of reasons. I mean, I'm sure that people want to claim the first European settlement just for the bragging rights, if you like, just for the pleasure of being the first. But I think pausing to reflect on the significance of settlement per se, and the creation of a settler society that would eventually come into conflict, although not immediately, with Indigenous, with Indigenous populations, with First Nations, really is another opportunity to refocus on the specific stories that come out of Atlantic Canada and the very, the unique kind of relationships that are forged with the particular settlement patterns that are engaged by the Acadian populations.
But you would have thought that it would be a demonstrable fact what the first European settlement in Canada was. No? Why is it still a subject of some debate?
Well, I mean, is it a subject of some debate? I mean, I think...
it is Port Royal is what you're saying.
It is. Well, I think Port Royal is perhaps the most significant site of European settlement that then becomes a long-standing European settlement. But of course, we have the example of L'Anse aux Meadows up in the tip of Newfoundland that was home to an attempted Viking settlement at around 1000 before the Common Era. And so it's not like Port Royal is the first attempt to settle Europeans permanently, but it is sort of the first successful attempt to engage in settler society creation and in settler colonialism. And I think that ushers in a particularly important period of Canadian history that must be told from more than one perspective.
In the last Ipsos Reid Dominion Institute benchmark study that dates back now about 7 or 8 years, 82% of Canadians aged 18 to 24 failed a basic test on Canadian history. 46% could name Canada's first Prime Minister no more. 27% knew who Louis Riel was, and only 26% could name the year of Confederation. How well do you think Canadians know our history? Brenda.
Well, I'm speaking as an Indigenous person, and I teach at University of Toronto, and I'm always surprised by students' reaction to learning about Indigenous studies. They come in with the fact that they didn't learn anything in school about Native people, and that they're learning it for the first time as adults. And so I would like to see, I know that's starting to change very slowly now, where our history is being included in curriculum today. I was dropping off my grandson one day a month ago, and for the first time I heard on the school intercom the acknowledgement of Indigenous land that we're on. And I almost stopped in the hallway and almost started crying in the hallway. It was the first time I ever heard that in a school. So things are changing. Things are starting to be more inclusive of our history and our culture. There's still, a long way to go and a lot of work to be done in education, but I think it's hopeful.
Jack, on that, how well we know our history, or why I suppose we know it perhaps not as well as we should.
No, I think our knowledge of our history is relatively low, but I'm a bit split about how bothered I am about that, even though I suspect, a lot of people may be surprised at that reaction, because we are not making history knowledge practical enough for people. And today we're in a society where there's a great desire to make knowledge very practical as regards our sort of day-to-day reality. So in the same way that, a lot of things we learn in high school, we outside of Quebec, a lot of us will learn French as a second language, but within a matter of a few years, if we're not using it, we're not going to remember it very well, if at all. And a lot of that is happening to history. We'll learn some in high school, but the extent to which we remember it after isn't very strong. And in part, it's because we aren't able to make it relatable to our day-to-day reality on the one hand. And on the other hand, we're not able to make it reflect or connect to us in a personal way. Right? So, we see the popularity of things like Ancestry.com, and that's because a lot of people are looking to relate things to their personal background and so forth, and we're not making history do that enough.
Lise Marie, I have a comment here from Angela, who's watching, and she asks, what might happen if we don't teach history?
We repeat it. That's the easy answer. But we all have a lot to learn from history if we get the proper facts, we get all the perspectives, and otherwise we're. I don't see how we can have a common vision as a nation, if we don't know about our own history. But a better knowledge, a much better knowledge of history than what we have right now.
Sasha, one chapter of Canada's history we've been asked about it is the Acadian expulsion. It wasn't included in the story of us. People were angry about that. Can you give us a brief overview?
Sure. The Acadian expulsion is interesting and important for Canadian history because of the type of community that was uprooted and deported was unique in Canadian and in North American history. I do believe we can trace the foundations back to 1605 in Port Royal, and the way that the Acadians sort of lived out their lives and created their own sense as a people apart is an important component of our foundational narrative of Canada. You know, they deployed, for instance, an adapted dike technology to clear arable land from the mudflats that are formed from the Fundy tides. And this didn't put them into open conflict over territory with the very powerful and more numerous Mi'kmaq First Nation. And that meant that they created a society that was very much integrated and had more or less of an equilibrium and enjoyed enjoyed a lot of intermarriage with the local First Nations, and it didn't displace them. And this is in contrast to some of the other narratives of settler sort of advancement in Canadian history. And we lose it with the deportation that occurred between 1755 and what was sort of ongoing until the Treaty of Paris sort of brought it to a halt in 1763. The Acadians, about 14,000 of them, were largely rounded up, and at least 11 or 12,000 were deported to other parts of North America. Some were sent to British seaports to languish for years while the British government decided what to do with them. Some of them were sent back to France with disastrous results, but when the Treaty of Paris was signed, and they had the option of returning as long as they took an oath of allegiance. This bears testimony to the strength of their unique identity as Acadians. They didn't just sort of integrate into the larger Quebec society. Some of them decided to stay in Louisiana and become Cajuns, but most of them, a good number of them, came back.
Marcel,
yeah.
What do we lose when we don't make sure that the Acadians' part in our story isn't somewhere in the foreground?
Well, it's quite simple. You'll have people going to New Brunswick, this summer, and then they'll say, "How come you speak French?" Because they assume that they are Quebecers who have decided, to buy a house, somewhere in Moncton or Bouctouche. Then what are we losing? It's the fact that people will discover that there are a group of people who speak French and they are not from Quebec. Then we need, to acknowledge it, because it is, an important moment, a defining moment in the history of this country. And it's to avoid, the mistake, because, why are we studying history? Well, it's to avoid, this mistake that, you will go to Nova Scotia and then you will discover, oh my goodness, I thought that all Afro-Canadians got in Nova Scotia 30 years ago. No, many of them arrived, after the War of Independence in the U.S. Then we need to study history in order, to better understand with whom, we interact, who we are, where we are coming from, and what we plan to do as a collectivity.
Lise Marie.
Yes, and to pursue that, there are some people who really won't have, this settled, very rosy version of the building of our nation. But I think if we don't have the courage to look at what the errors we made and the bad things that we did, we won't learn from them, and we become complacent, and then we compare ourselves and say, oh, Canada doesn't need any fixing because we've always been perfect. That's not true. That's not true. And looking at what's happening around the world right now, we need that more than ever. We need to look at what we didn't do well and to say, well, we won't do that again because we know why we did it, and we know it wasn't a good reason, and that's the only way that we can keep ourselves together. We need to learn from history, not to learn that we are perfect and that we always did things perfectly, but we need to know that we stumbled as a nation, and a pre-Confederation and after Confederation in many ways, many times, and why, so that we don't repeat that.
Jack, is it clear to you who the us is in the story of us, and is it the same as le nous au Québec?
No, I don't think it's the same as the nous au Québec, but the very use of the term us can be challenging and possibly problematic. The series is very events-based. It's making some choices as to what events it thinks are the ones that will probably resonate most with the viewing audience on the one hand, and on the other hand, best reflect what are sort of the big moments or episodes that a lot of Canadians identify with. When you make those choices, you're going to leave things out. And in this case, some important things were left out. But at the same time, it's packaged as a story of us. So us suggests that it's close to a people's story, or about, if you like, a large community that has some shared characteristics or objectives. But then again, it's something that's very events-based, even though, again, I don't want to diminish that. They're very critical events. But inevitably in those choices, you're going to leave things out. It was a very ambitious project, possibly too ambitious, for what it purported to do.
Knowing, Brenda, that Canada is made up of different nations, including the First Nations, what's the best approach to telling the story of the land?
Well, this is a start, inviting Native people on to talk about their own histories. But I think education is probably the best way to teach that history, starting in elementary school. And that's probably the best path, I think, to take as a country.
Lise Marie, a lot of the feedback that we've gotten from Quebec, from French Canada, was a concern over stereotypical views of French characters, including Radisson de Groseilliers and Samuel de Champlain. Do you think that creeps in when history is being told?
Well, historical figures become archetypal. And it's not limited to francophones figures. You know,
On disait qu'il paraissait sale, Samuel de Champlain.
Yeah. For me, that's not entirely interesting as a debate. I think that
why not? Why not?
Why not?
Why do you think it came up? Because it came up by several people, and came up from historians too.
I need help from
Marcel
on this one.
Wants to jump in on this one.
It's because what happened is you have, and of course we go back to episode number 1. Yeah. Then what happened in episode number 1, you have, Champlain. Champlain, who is depicted as, this creepy guy who he's afraid that, some people may want to kill him, and he wants, to demonstrate that he's a strong leader. And then the episode ends with, Wolfe, who showed up on the Plains of Abraham. His uniform is impeccable, not an inch of, dirt. And then, of course, people compare, both, and they say, okay, what was, at stake? The same thing happened with, episode number 3, where, the way the American generals are being depicted, it's basically a bunch of individuals who had, some mental problems, as opposed to the British ones, who seem to be in control of everything. Then you wonder, why is it done? Is it done because, they want to capture our emotions? Is it done because...
it's good television.
It's television. Well, I know that I know that this is because the other thing that is interesting in this series is this dialogue between the present and the past, because often you will have, for instance, the former head of the Canadian, Army, Rick Haylier, who was asked basically to put himself in the shoes of, a British soldier and try, to relate to his to his views. And what they are trying to do with the series, it's to basically to create, this dialogue between the present and the past, assuming that, well, because this is how the General Haylier would have felt, well, this is probably how, a British, soldier, which is always, dangerous, because if the goal is to get in the head of, Wolfe, Montcalm, etc., well, we could go ask, those who have studied Wolfe, Champlain, and Montcalm, and come and feed us with, what were their emotions, at the time.
I have a question from the audience. It's from YouTube, and it's from Rahul Mehta, who has gotten in touch to ask, do we need a national strategy, I guess a pan-Canadian strategy, for education on Canadian history to include more diverse voices? Now, who wants to... Lise Marie, you're nodding.
Well, a national strategy, this is a non-starter because, as we know, education is a provincial jurisdiction. Then you start with, 10 provinces. Each of them, will design their own, history programs. By the way, there are some provinces that, they do not have, history compulsory.
And so is it any surprise that you have so many diverse views and opinions in such a debate when you try to do a program on the national broadcast?
Well, on the one hand, we should not be, surprised. On the other hand, I think we should have, they should have tried, to be more inclusive. But on the issue of, including, those voices, I have to admit that, if you compare what we teach right now with, what was taught 10 years ago or 20 years ago, we have made, some progress. I understand the frustration from Indigenous, and in fact, I share the frustration from Indigenous people when, not only Indigenous, also non-Indigenous. We had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That commission made Canadians aware about, the tragedy called, residential schools. And I think we have a duty now, everybody, us right now, but also those in the classroom, to make sure that the Canadians learn about, residential school. It went on, for 100. It was, an attempt to destroy. We are talking of human beings. And this is, a tragedy that not only we have to acknowledge, but we have also to make sure that those the voices that have been silent are no longer, silent.
Sasha, on that same question, I wonder if you have that same instinctive reaction that Marcel had about the idea, the question from Rahul about a national conversation on Canadian history. He said there's a non-starter. Is that the way you see it?
Well, certainly it would be very challenging to create a national curriculum given the realities that Marcel correctly alluded to. I am sitting in a province that doesn't have sort of a mandatory curriculum for Canadian history. There's a mandatory social science curriculum, and students can choose to take history as part of it, but they're not obliged to. And so inevitably, I get students in my first and second year classes for whom you have sort of a very low, sort of basic level of Canadian historical literacy. It's just increasingly part of my job to kind of address this, to teach them some of the basic sort of points in the narrative around which you can build sort of different debates about the meaning associated with things like Confederation or this war or that war. I think, though, that this is part of, we don't necessarily need to see this always as a problem. I think that any kind of healthy democracy is going to debate its own history, and I think we run into problems when we stop debating our own history, and when we do come up with a singular narrative. That's probably a moment where we want to take a good hard look at, whether we've really sort of achieved something important or whether we've just stifled debate. Well, I think that the good thing that's come out of Canada, the Story of Us, is our dialogues like this. And I think that we need to think very critically and carefully about the narratives that we construct and certainly become more inclusive. But that begins with a really tough consideration about how we depict settler Indigenous relationships in these kinds of narratives. And this is where I really feel the Story of Us falls up short.
The CBC has made the point about the Story of Us that it is a populist history aimed at people who may not be engaged with our history. Jack, how do you get people interested in Canadian history? I mean, maybe, I don't know whether you agree with that assertion as well from CBC?
Well, I think you've got to make it relevant to their something that connects their contemporary reality, though I agree with the point Marcel made earlier when you bring Rick Hillier in to try to interpret for us what he would have done if he was a British general in the 18th century. That's fraught with very high risk, and the high risk being that there's something ahistorical that's going to emerge from that type of depiction. So again, it comes down to trying to make this relevant to things contemporary. Some of the other panelists have said that it's extremely important to know our history so that we don't repeat many of the errors we've made in the past. It also has to be made very practical. I'm not suggesting that not repeating the errors of the past isn't practical, but we have to find ways to make it practical. Because when I speak to people in high schools, teachers and curriculum developers and others, many of them think that math is more important than history. It shouldn't be that choices like that are made, but very often that is what's happening. Our kids are not being encouraged to learn history, and That's because as much as in many of the surveys that we do, people are saying it's important to know our history, they don't seem to be willing to go to the next step, which is to encourage people in the education system to make it more of a priority, even where it's mandatory. You know, we're not seeing enough done to make it relevant so that there'll be a good level of retention of what's learned beyond high school.
Marcel, est-ce que c'est une chose saine que d'avoir des versions de l'histoire qui s'affrontent?
C'est-à-dire
different versions of history.
La possibilité d'avoir ce dialogue.
Welcome the possibility of having that dialogue. This being said, of course, we expect that when a broadcaster invests important resources, we expect to have the history that is shown to us to be a history that will take into account important facts, and we could be surprised that be such strong reactions, not just from Nova Scotia, but also Quebec. In the case of Nova Scotia, it's not the first time that our friends from the Maritimes are telling us, you forgot about us. It happened with the Popular History of Canada series, and here it happens again with the history of us again. So saying that it's a popular history, we can show a beautiful popular history that is inclusive. I think it's possible to do that. Choices were made, of course. Most people would like to know about the reasons of those choices. But the fact that there should be a confrontation, it's inevitable. We can welcome that. And if that brings people to decide to show their own interest in history, look at websites and open books, I'll say, great, bravo. And if that elicits a curiosity for history, that's very good. But I would like to refer to statements that were made before, and this we see that in our classrooms. Unfortunately, we live in a society which places great value not just on acquiring general or theoretical knowledge, but we are being told if you want a job today, go into sciences or technical sciences. I say that a well-rounded person should have all kinds of knowledge, historical, living in society, an objective version of the history in the Maritimes. No, I don't think that exists. Completely objective, no, there will be always an element of subjectiveness, but I think that with goodwill we can have subjectivenesses that live together intelligently and that form an interesting discourse or dialogue where we can all find ourselves in some way. And I would like to add that one of the reasons for this controversy Marcel started mentioning it's because it comes from a public broadcaster. A few months ago, when I heard about this type of series as part of what all the things that the government has been preparing to celebrate the 150th birthday of Confederation, I was maybe naive, but I immediately thought it for granted that it would be a series that would be jointly produced by CBC, Radio-Canada and Acadian, and that it would be something that would cover the perspective of various different audiences. And I was extremely surprised to see that this broadcast, this program was produced only in English for an Anglophone audience. But it's the money of all taxpayers of Canada which is being spent on this. So this one of the sources of frustration that I've had, because all as Canadians, we all feel that the public broadcaster belongs to us, and this would not happen with a private broadcaster.
A solid history of Canada from an Indigenous perspective.
I think a lot of efforts have been made by CBC. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women issue, 8th Fire series has been very successful. So I see a lot of positive changes in the media. I think it's doing a lot better today.
On the right track.
Yes, I think you're on the right track.
But how far away from the destination do you think we are?
Oh, I don't know. What is the destination?
I don't know. I mean, do you think that people really across Canada have a good sense of Indigenous history in Canada still?
No.
No, I mean, it seems far away from it.
Yeah,
to
there's
me.
still a long way to go. But I do see that we're going in the right direction at least.
That's the time we have for this week, and I want to thank you for joining us for our first digital discussion. We'll be back next week for another. Please keep the conversation going online. We want to hear the topics you'd like to see explored in further editions, guests you want to hear from, your thoughts and questions about Canadian history. Also, if you want to see more, then there's a lot there for you. Check out the Canadian history section. These are programs already available. You can find them on ici.2.tv
ici.2.tv.
watch.cbc.ca. And I'd like to thank our guests for joining us, Sasha, Jack, Brenda, Lise Marie, and Marcel. And we'll be back again next week on Facebook and YouTube, streaming in French and English. Thanks for joining us, and good night.
Yeah.
I have to say I probably over prepared, and I got through about only about